This webinar is organized by the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, also known as CDKN. And thank you for taking the time for joining us. My name is Maria Jose Pacha, and I am the Knowledge and Networks Manager for Latin American and the Caribbean for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. So before we begin, I want you to go over through some logistics and some frequently asked questions. Today's presentation will be recorded. After a few days, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Simply look for it in our CDKN YouTube channel. There are also two options for listening to this session. One is through plugging into your computer and the other via telephone that was provided in your registration message. If you experience audio difficulties in listening to this session, this is because you have too many browsers, windows, or software open, so feel free to close these. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a chat message to my colleagues and we will try to sort it out. Questions are very welcome, so please write them in the toolbar on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible in the time available. After this brief introduction, I will ask you please to answer the quick poll about you, so we know where you're from and where do you work. So the first poll we would appreciate your answer is, in which sector do you work? And it would be great if you can answer this in the coming months, in the coming minutes, sorry. So it would be great to know if you work in the government sector, with NGOs, or at the private sector. We are just waiting to receive more of your answers. Thank you so much. Okay, great. And then we have another poll. We would like to know, which region are you from? Okay, so we have most of our listeners are from Europe, then followed by Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the last from North America. Well, great. Thank you very much for this. So it's very good to know that we have such a wide representation. So our speakers today are Mrs. Kiran Sura. She has been CDKN's Head of Advocacy Fund for Negotiation Support since 2012. So the Advocacy Fund assists least developed and climate vulnerable countries to have a say in the international climate negotiation to the benefit of us all. Before joining CDKN, Kiran was a senior analyst with the Committee on Climate Change, an independent body advising the UK government on climate change mitigation and adaptation policy. During this time, Kiran conducted analysis that underpinned the committee's recommendations on the 2050 emission reduction target for the UK. More recently, she was involved in developing a monitoring and evaluation framework for tracking progress on adaptation and developed the first adaptation cost curves for England. Kiran has an MSc in economics with reference to Sub-Saharan Africa from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Our second speaker, Mr. Chris Dodwell, is Ricardo Aiello's Director of International Projects with responsibility for developing relationships with international clients and partners and directing key international projects. Chris has over 20 years public and private sector experience in climate change, sustainable energy, and environmental policy and regulation, specializing in international climate change and capacity building. Prior to joining Ricardo IAEA in 2011, Chris worked at the heart of the UK climate change policy for 10 years, including leading the UK implementation of the EU emission trading scheme and acting as head of the UK delegation to the UNFCCC climate negotiations. Chris is currently working on a number of projects to support the development of intended national determined contributions in a variety of countries, including Bangladesh, Cambodia, Kenya, Laos, and Myanmar, as well as an ongoing project for the CDKN to examine lessons learned from their portfolio of INDC projects. So thank you for being here with us. And now I hand it over to Kieran.
Hi, thank you very much, Maria Jose. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone that's on the line and has joined the webinar. Before I hand over to Chris to take you through the guide and all that's in there, I just wanted to briefly give you an overview of CDKN's activities in the INDC space. So CDKN is supporting INDC preparations in 8 countries across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We are working in Peru, Colombia, Ethiopia, Kenya, the Gambia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Uganda. And CDKN is funding a combination of technical assistance and stakeholder consultation processes in each of these countries. All 8 INDCs have common elements, but are taking very different approaches to developing the elements of their INDCs. All projects have very different starting points and are at different stages in the INDC preparation process and maturity. For the substantive part, most INDCs are likely to be submitted towards the end of summer, early autumn, but there are a couple of countries in our portfolio that hopefully should be submitting their INDC submissions imminently. So CDKN is working with a range of different suppliers and local teams in each country, of which one is Ricardo IAEA. We are working very closely with these countries, and what we have heard in our consultations with these countries over the last few months is that there is a real need for practical guidance to complement the existing guidance that has been developed by the UNFCCC, UNDP and GIZ on how to prepare your INDC submissions and contributions. So CDKN has worked closely with Ricardo IAEA to meet that existing gap in the current guidance to produce this practical guide. Before I hand over to Chris to take you through the guide in a bit more detail, I just wanted to cite you on CDKN's future activities in the INDC space. So over the coming months, we will be convening various platforms and publishing papers to share our country experiences on INDC preparation and also the lessons that we're learning. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. So now I'd like to move on to the heart of the webinar. Thanks very much to CDKN for inviting me to speak about this. We will have a chance to answer questions later, as Maria Jose was explaining. And I'm fortunate enough to be joined by my colleague Emilia Holdaway, who's working on a couple of our INDC projects and help write the guide. So Emilia may well weigh in for the tougher of your questions. So first question is, why did we think it would be helpful to come up with a guide that was sort of specifically focused on the less developed countries? There's quite a few guides out there. Kieran's already referred to them. And I suppose that the most simple answer to that is that we were getting a request in all of the projects that we worked on to show what an INDC looked like, very early on. What's this thing that we're going to be taking to our ministers to approve? An outline draft. And in part, that's the need that this guide seeks to address. But the other questions really are driven by the fact that for developing countries, actually, there are additional things that they want to say in their INDC that aren't covered by perhaps the short INDCs that we've seen produced by countries like Switzerland, by the European Commission thus far. And a few of the common challenges that LDCs face are set out on this slide. So one of them is that actually mitigation and the amount of their emissions is not very material in global terms, but there is a wish within those countries to take action and to reduce their emissions in the future. Their emissions in the future are likely to come from different sources from current emissions, but they want to get hold of that early. They want to have a low carbon development pathway. And that's both to address their own development concerns, but also to encourage greater action by others and therefore to limit future climate change. The second one is that the driver is unlikely of action in these countries is unlikely to be simply greenhouse gas emission reductions. The prevailing need for economic development and poverty reduction trumps everything. But countries are already mainstreaming climate change into their development plans. And actually, the INDC provides a real opportunity to demonstrate that development can be undertaken in a low carbon, climate resilient way and to showcase some of the efforts. So there needs to be a balance, yes, but there is an opportunity that is being recognized. Thirdly, whilst there's a spectrum of capacity across LDCs, in general, there is a real capacity constraint in terms of the technical ability to develop and implement INDCs, and therefore there's a certain commonality there that can be addressed. Fourthly, it's very likely that the level of ambition in the INDC is going to be conditional on receipt of international support. So the section on means of implementation, which actually is something that you don't really see in the INDCs delivered today, is going to be really important to LDCs. And finally, and maybe most obviously, adaptation is likely to be a major focus of INDCs. Now, there are strong synergies between mitigation and adaptation activity in these countries. And I'll come back to this question later because I think it's one of the most exciting and interesting aspects of preparing INDCs for less developed countries. So as I said, another driver, well, a key driver was basically the express request to CDKN for guidance that was more practically entabled. And the last one is that actually the best way to guide people onto what an INDC looks like is to show them a precedent. Now, we've had a number of INDCs that have emerged over recent weeks, but actually there's no real example of there's one that's now come out for the Gambia, but apart from that, there's no real example of precedents. So actually what we tried to do here was to come up with something that would allow countries to see what that INDC looked like. So moving on, what does the template do and what doesn't it do? So the first issue is, as I say, it's a practical example of how an INDC could be structured and its possible elements. So that can give the officials working on this really early sight of the sort of shape of document that they're going to be sending off for political agreement. Each section of the guide cross-references the relevant text of the UNFCCC. So where there is UNFCCC language, you've got that right there in front of you. We've also identified the data sources for completing each section. Every country is likely to have numerous pieces of data out there, but it'll be diffusely held across lots of different documents. So that's just to try to help people identify where the answers may lie. I think one of the really interesting aspects of guidance, certainly one of the most interesting parts of it to draft, was actually the illustrative examples. Thinking about how the narrative for an INDC might develop, the rationale. These are only examples, so they'll all need to be tailored in light of national circumstances. But I suggest that you read those. They'll be quite interesting for you. And lastly, we had to reflect the fact that there's a broad spectrum of approaches that LDCs are going to take. Different levels of national capacity, different levels of preparedness and ambition. But we've sought to try to come up with something that looks like an end product. Now, what the template doesn't do is it certainly doesn't seek to duplicate the really excellent guidance that's out there about how countries develop the content for their INDC. We've looked at that guidance. It's incredibly useful, and there's no doubt that kind of our guide stands on the shoulders of the work of others. So WRI and UNDP are just launched recently a sort of revised version of their guidance, which now covers adaptation as well as the mitigation sections. And there's also excellent guidance out there by GIZ and others on the consultation processes and the national processes. So this is not an effort to replicate that. We're trying to define what the end product looks like, and it's in that spirit. So before I get onto the detail of the guide, if we could just talk quickly about how it was developed. So basically what we did was we spoke to the authors of some of the existing guidance. We spoke to organizations like UNDP to ask them what their insights and lessons learned from things like the INDC workshops they've been holding. We spoke to the representatives of the LDCs and the small island states in the negotiations. We asked them kind of what they felt the needs of their groups were, and we spoke with the people that had actually been working on the ground with CDKN to support domestic INDC preparations. And as I said, we also looked closely at the INDC guidance and all of the INDCs that had been published to date. So just to kick off with a sort of overview of the guide. So it's split into 5 sections: the national context, the mitigation contribution, that looks at 3 sections there: the type of the contribution and its level, detailed information to support that, and kind of why the contribution is considered to be fair and ambitious. We then looked at an adaptation component, what an adaptation component of an INDC might look like. And then the last 2 sections are really to do with implementation, because I suppose one of the key fundamental points of the INDC process is that ambition is nothing without implementation. So we looked at the implementation of INDCs from 2 perspectives: from the national perspective in terms of the planning process, and from the international perspective in terms of the support that countries would need, the means of implementation. So I'll now go through each of those sections of the guide. I'm going to do that relatively quickly. I think some people have seen these. I'll try and cover this off in about 10 minutes, and then we'll have the chance for everyone to ask questions after that. Okay, so national context. When we were launching the guide, actually, last week at the GIZ UNDP conference on INDCs in Berlin, we had a question from the audience about the importance of context, and my rather easily to say but truly felt response was that the context is absolutely everything with INDCs. And I think that it is really important to set out from the start why the country has adopted the approach that it has taken. So we've looked at this and thought that an introductory section that actually tries to summarize that context sets the scene very well for an INDC from a least developed country. In particular, the need to articulate how the actions that have been selected, how the level of ambition that has been developed is consistent with the national development priorities of the country, with existing plans and strategies, and hopefully has pushed out those plans and strategies a little bit further into the future. So key data sources to get this across will be things like the national development plans, the 5-year plans of the country, or the medium-term plans, however they're framed. They're very likely to have now been looked at with some mainstreaming of climate change into those plans. Equally, there could well be climate change strategies and action plans that have been developed alongside. The timeframes of those may not quite stretch out as far as INDCs are meant to. worth recalling that the INDCs are meant to be for the post-2020 period. So ideally, they should be taking actions and setting an agenda for 2025 or hopefully 2030, if not beyond. So there may be a need to extend some of that and think about how much of the stuff in those strategies goes that far. Also, green growth strategies. There'll be other things that are cover different names, but actually cover the same substance. So all of these are good data sources, as are the national communications to the UNFCCC themselves. So what could be the possible content of this? Well, as I've said, the articulation of that link between climate change and national development priorities, I think, is an essential. If you're going to take an INDC to cabinet level or ministerial or even head of government level, they need to recognize why the actions that are being proposed link in with national development priorities. That may be the acquisition of a sort of the achievement of middle income status by a particular target date, or it may contain things about where the economy wants to develop, the sorts of sectors the economy is growing into. Links to how climate is going to impact that particular country and identification of those priority sectors and themes is another area that can be featured here, and obviously reference to any national, subnational or sectoral strategies. Good moment to bring those in here, as well as the existing climate change pledges and commitments. Now, one thing that we really want to make clear is that INDCs do need to be brief. But if you're going to take more than if you're going to take more than a couple of maybe a handful of pages, you may want to summarize the key points of the INDC in this section. Moving on to the mitigation contribution. So what we're not trying to do here is identify how you would spell out that mitigation contribution, but it's the outcome of that process. There will have been a national INDC preparation process in country, and it could be that that results in a list of action-based contributions that a country is likely to take. That could well be what a least developed country is likely to do. Some least developed countries will feel emboldened and prepared enough to take on economy-wide or sectoral outcome-based contributions, which could be greenhouse gases or they could be something else. So you need to basically be demonstrating the outcome of that process and the thing that the ministers have agreed to here in terms of a mitigation contribution. But it should be described at a high level. We don't want to go into reams of detail. Very, very possible to have a separate document that you refer to with your INDC that is kept on a different website and can be accessed in detail. The sort of high-level information I'm talking about is the name or title of the activity, the description of it, the objectives, whether they're quantitative or qualitative. And examples of this kind of thing could be, say a commitment to impose a tax or some kind, or a renewable energy strategy if you're going for an action-based contribution, waste management strategies, REDD+ programs, things like that. And I think a really helpful thing to do, if possible, is to put in the aggregate impact of the proposed activities on your future emissions. Moving on. The next area is the information that's needed to facilitate the clarity, transparency and understanding. And this is UNFCCC language. There's a lot of good guidance out there about the detailed information that you can put forward. In the guide, again, we've identified those key data sources. In terms of the possible content, we've put in tables that identify the types of information that would be applicable to both action-based contributions and outcome-based contributions, and also we've identified the different types of information that might be put in place for each of them. Another thing that's very helpful to facilitate understanding is some kind of long-term goal or peak year, and this could be included in this section or elsewhere in the mitigation section. The next stage is the fair and ambitious section. Again, this comes from the UNFCCC, and really this is intended to show how the contribution described in the previous sections is considered to be fair and ambitious in light of national circumstances and the Article 2 objective of effectively limiting concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, the narrative relating to fairness is going to vary from country to country, but every country will be able to explain why it thinks what it's doing is fair. So, and that may be taken from political statements. It may relate to metrics to do with burden sharing or historical responsibility, but a real thing the INDC can do is allow countries to articulate that transparently, so everyone has a clear idea of why you're doing what you are doing and why you consider that to be ambitious. A good example might be, say, a commitment not to exceed a particular per capita level of emissions in the long or medium term. And you could say, well, that's what each country needs to do. We are going to converge towards that, which could allow growth, very likely to allow growth in LDCs. Another way of approaching it is by talking about your national circumstances, your emission trends, your population trends. Another one could be to talk about the mitigation potential that exists in the country and the costs of that, and then the extent to which you intend to realize that potential in your INDC. And of course, some of the constraints that you may need to put in place would relate to your capability, but also perhaps the co-benefits that you're seeking to achieve through the INDC. So say, for example, you've put forward measures that actually are going to deliver national benefits, and you focus on those principally. So that's the mitigation section. And as I said, there's quite a lot that's been written about the mitigation section in other guides. But again, we're just trying to boil this down to the nub of what's required. So moving on to adaptation, where I don't actually, I mean, there are a couple of INDCs that have started to get into this, but again, Mexico, for example, has an interesting approach to adaptation, but they're written from the perspective of slightly more developed countries. So what I think that really there are two issues to address in the adaptation section. The first one is, your adaptation priorities, the adaptation plans, and what has been put in place and what is planned in the future. So a brief summary. I mean, some people have said to me, well, why do you need to put this in? These already exist in other documents. I think the reality is they may exist in other documents, but they're rarely read from those other documents, and certainly they're not put to ministers and put into the international community in an accessible form. So this is your opportunity to actually bring those out. That can include your requirements for capacity building, for finance, for technological support. The second thing that I think is a really key opportunity here for INDCs, and it goes to the narrative as well, is looking at those synergies between mitigation and adaptation. Historically, it was felt that this only existed in a couple of sectors, but I think as climate change has been mainstreamed into development, more and more areas are being found that will deliver both adaptation and mitigation benefits. So there are various ways you can go about doing this. You can screen your adaptation portfolio and try and calculate the mitigation co-benefits, greenhouse gas reductions, and try to ensure that the way you adapt is done in a low carbon way, avoiding things that are very intensive on fossil fuels in strengthening your infrastructure, for example, and going for win-win solutions. But equally, you need to be looking at your mitigation activities and thinking about are those going to be resilient in a future changed climate? Reliance on hydropower may be inappropriate if you can see that rainfall patterns are going to address flows on your major rivers, and you may want to have more of a diversification of your renewables approach. And then finally, plans for monitoring and reporting adaptation activities, and I'll come on and talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So the last section really is about implementation. As I said, from the national level and from the international level. And INDCs, INDCs could be pure flights of fancy. And they're only going to get taken seriously if they've got robust implementation plans put together. That's when funding is going to flow as a result of these. If donors can see that there are realistic plans in place, legislation, institutional structures that will actually ensure delivery. So we've tried to highlight a few ideas here about what the possible content of this section could be, the planning processes that are in the national or subnational plans, the national MRV systems. That's not just greenhouse gas inventories, but also systems for NAMAs and their monitoring and reporting, and for tracking the use of international climate finance. Legislation and institutional structures that are designed to ensure the INDC is developed, and other issues like synergies with the national development plans, links with the sectoral action plans led by line ministries. So, for example, if your renewable energy ministry has a master plan, they will have its own kind of implementation plan for that. Similarly, can go for energy efficiency. And then there will also be related awareness raising activities and stakeholder engagement and capacity building that one might want to include here to demonstrate really this INDC is going to be delivered. And then the last section is on the means of implementation, effectively the support that is being requested to both implement and monitor the progress of the INDC. And again, a lot of this may well be found in existing sources, technology needs assessments, which I think is a really useful document for a number of parts of the INDC, the bilateral and multilateral support to date, NAMAs, also some of the new climate public expenditure and institutional review reports, the CPEIRs. The content, well, this could range from financial support. It could range from, if advanced enough, it could be actual requests for international finance to complement domestic spend on climate change. But equally, it could be requests for capacity building or technology transfer. And I think one of the things that we found quite interesting to draft in the guide was what a summary table might look like that would specify the different types of support required, their scale and the timing, alongside the specific activities the INDC has proposed. So that is a quick tour of the guide and each of its sections. I hope that's helpful and interesting, and that I'm sure you've got a few questions on the back of that. The one issue that I would flag just off is that there is in terms of timing, these are intended nationally determined contributions, and they need to be submitted in 2015 for the post-2020 period. So they're not the end of the story. And I certainly think for LDCs that they are an opportunity to put forward ideas rather than necessarily to feel that everything is set in concrete once submitted. We are briefly about the next steps. We are consulting at the moment on this first edition of the guide. So there's a few things that we've done here. We're having this kind of webinar to share it. We're hoping for feedback. We'd welcome any email feedback as well. So do please give us your views on, and we'll be asking some questions in a moment on which bits people may find most useful in principle, or if you've already read it, what you've already had on it, what you've already had in terms of your views on it. And we are field testing it. We're already applying it on the ground. We are hoping to use it in small island developing states as well. And as I said, your feedback is very welcome. So thank you for your time, and I'll hand back over to Maria Jose to coordinate on the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for this very interesting presentation. Now we are having some questions from the people there. So we have 8 or 9 questions. So we will try to be very brief on answering them. And if you have any further ones, you can contact us after the webinar. So we have a question from Carolina Proaño. Does the UNFCCC have a mechanism to verify the INDCs? So who would like to answer this one?
Yeah, Chris here. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So in terms of verification of the INDCs, I mean, I think that will come in time. Formally, the UNFCCC has said that what it is going to do is put together a synthesis report that kind of brings together all of the INDCs delivered by September, and then they'll be produced and discussed as part of the Paris negotiations. I suppose what you mean by verifying is there a way of verifying whether or not the levels of ambition and the numbers put in are correct? And the entire INDC process is very driven by the fact that last time round, when countries were putting in pledges at Copenhagen and Cancun, there was no upfront information provided. So that section I mentioned about additional information is very much, and the guidance the UNFCCC has given on that is very much driven by the fact that you need to be able to understand targets and contributions, commitments much more clearly than simply just getting a X% by 2025. So that information will be assessed during the process that follows Paris, I'm sure.
Okay. And sorry, this is Kieran. Just to add to that, Chris and I were at the Berlin INDC workshop last week, and there were some quite lengthy discussions around what type of information countries thought that they would need to be able to put in contributions that were comparable and verifiable. And there was much discussion around the use of static and dynamic baselines and making sure that submissions were clear on what actions were being put in the INDC and how they were additional to the current policy landscape. So,
okay, thank you. I would appreciate if you have questions, please write them on the space provided. At the moment, we cannot give the floor to people to ask questions themselves because of the time limitation. So we have a question from Benjamin, the reader. He says, as most countries are in the early stages under the UNFCCC to go through the NAP process, so how do you see the practical linkage and engagement between INDC and NAPs?
So Chris here. So I suppose, as I was saying in the adaptation section, I think there's a really good chance for the country to explain what its plans are in relation to national adaptation plans, to talk about the likely priority sectors, to talk about the timeframes they've got in mind for the completion of that exercise and any emerging conclusions. But it's not meant to prejudice the output of the national adaptation plan process. So, it may well be that countries have NAPAs already prepared that allow them to put some information about that. So I don't think that it is, I think it exists in parallel to rather than a replacement for the national adaptation plans. I mean, it's interesting that the evolution of why adaptation are in INDCs at all has been an interesting exercise, and we could have a whole webinar about that. But I suppose the important point is that some countries felt that adaptation may be overlooked, and we wouldn't be giving wouldn't get an equivalent airing as mitigation. So actually, well, now's the opportunity to kind of to take up that and to address it. And the national adaptation plan is. Again, exists alongside, it doesn't replace the INDC.
Great, thank you, Chris. And here we have a question by Rachel Rowland. She says, I'm interested to know what the team think about how an INDC will survive changes of government because they are so long term. Do we have examples of where to look for this? For instance, Ethiopia over forthcoming elections. Or put another way, how is an INDC expected to be updated with political change in a country over this long time frame? Silence in the room.
Well, I might hand over to Chris and Amelia for the developing country perspective on that. But I mean, from a developed country perspective, given my background, as I hope some people will know, the UK has legislated action on climate change and set targets for both the 2030 and the 2050 period. And that legislation has the support of all political parties in the UK. So for countries such as the UK and those that do have climate change legislation, one would hope that the contributions that do come forward for those countries do have some longevity. But I think it is fair to say that the political process is a really important aspect of the development of a contribution. Here our guide has focused very much on the technical analysis that you can undertake to build your contributions, but the political aspect and the political processes that sit around that are just as important. And that may mean getting the buy-in of the existing government, but it can be broader than that, and it can sort of have cross-party domestic political support. But I may hand over to Chris and Emilia at this stage.
Hello, Emilia Holdaway from Ricardo AEA. I might just put my 2 cents in here. I think it's worth thinking about the INDC itself and what its status is. So the INDC does not represent a legal commitment on the part of the country. It is an intended contribution, and then of course at the negotiations in Paris will be the robust discussions between negotiators about what commitments countries may make that may have legal force within the context of the UNFCCC. I think coming from an LDC perspective in particular, and the INDC and the level of ambition that may be within the INDC, I think we have to be realistic that there will be aspects of the INDC that will be about unilateral action by the countries. But I do think we will be seeing a significant contribution that countries are wishing to make, being conditional on international support. So I think that brings another dimension, and I think as international support flows over time, hopefully the countries will continue to be willing to take that up.
Okay, well, thank you. We have another question here from Eric Boone. He says, INDC, is it intended to indicate new intentions, or is it often merely an aggregate of existing initiatives such as NAMA, etc.?
Okay, I'll answer that one if I may, Eric. Countries are urged to do more in their INDCs. They're urged to go beyond existing requirements. It's in the UNFCCC text. And that, I suppose, is perhaps why one of the easy option for us is to focus on LDCs here. So for developed countries and for developing countries that have made pledges, they need to be going beyond those. They need to be going beyond them in terms of their timeframes, for the 2025 period, for 2030, and they need to go beyond them in terms of the level of ambition. And that's why showing how together they, with equivalent efforts from others, they put the world on a 2-degree trajectory is an important point of INDCs. But the reality is that for a lot of LDCs, they haven't really put forward much. There are a few NAMAs out there, and actually bringing those NAMAs together, aggregating them, considering what their impact may be in a longer time frame, and perhaps thinking about whether there are other sectors that need to be looked at and prioritized over the coming years in terms of new measures, that may well be sufficient. But it really will depend on a country-to-country basis.
Okay, thank you. Here we have Leonardo Masai. He wonders, what is the interest of LDCs to put forward their INDC at this stage? Shouldn't we first wait and see what developed countries and major developing countries will present?
I'll take this one first and then I'll hand over to Emilia. Especially from the countries that CDKN has been supporting, we have seen many developed and least developed countries wanting to come forward with ambitious action to demonstrate climate leadership. these countries do have the moral authority. That is very much not in question, but they want to be part of the solution and want to show that they are themselves putting their front foot forward alongside the larger, more developed emitters. And we're there and there to support that country leadership and that country true voice. And I think it's important for building the right political momentum and setting the right sort of ambition around what we want to achieve in Paris in December.
Mm-hmm. Emilia Holdaway. So just adding to Kieran's comments there, I think INDCs provide an opportunity to showcase activity at a country level. There certainly is examples of outstanding practice within LDCs. And I think secondly, the INDC provides an opportunity for countries to frame the type of international support that they're needing going forward. And certainly the INDCs are going to be much scrutinised by donors, but also we're getting flags from the investment community as well. So I think INDCs will be a very important document for LDCs and other countries going forward.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. We have 2 questions by Sandeep Kanda. How are INDCs linked or related to the national communications/BURs? And the other one, are the INDC to be submitted regularly or could be updated?
Okay, so I'll take the second one first. It's not clear exactly whether INDCs are going to be submitted regularly or can be updated, but it seems quite likely. So the INDC process that we have got involved in country, we have made it absolutely key to that we're building enduring capacity to go back to look at the numbers and the analysis to be able to update it in the event that countries will be doing this again in a few years. And actually they'll need that for national implementation. So one model is that we're now moving into a 5-year process that has been proposed. As I say, none of this is absolutely certain yet. A model is that we're moving into a 5-year process and that this is part of that process. On the link between INDCs and national communications, there is a very strong link. A lot of the data that goes into the national communications, a lot of the sections are actually quite similar to the INDC. The difference is the political sort of status and the function of the INDC. So, and basically a national communication doesn't get signed off by cabinet. In a nutshell, and you will find that sometimes the mitigation analysis that is in those national communications, it's theoretical rather than applied. And whereas an INDC really needs to be more robust, needs to have gone through a much bigger consultation exercise in terms of getting country buy-in. And buy-in by high-level officials. So, I'd say, whilst the numbers and the sections may look the same, the status is very difficult and it needs much more careful preparation.
Okay, thank you. Here we have a question by Snesana from Montenegro. It says, can you please explain the difference between INDC, national communications, and the BUR, since this document looks very much like a short version of a national communication report? It would be more useful to have a national contributions expressed in quantitative measures. Numbering actions as part of a national contribution is not good enough. Governments tend to commit conducting mitigation/adaptation actions, but at the end, it is ending with organizing a hand of workshops/roundtables or useless reports.
Okay, well, I think I've answered part of that on the difference between national communications and BURs, and I suppose maybe that's the answer to your second point, is that this isn't intended to be a theoretical exercise. And when you look at the stakeholder engagement that has been undertaken in certainly in the countries that we're working in, it is very much about building a broad basis of support across line ministries, at a devolved level in Kenya with lots and lots of different county level consultations to ensure that the action plan is something that gets delivered and reflects the priorities of the country. I think you, so I think this is different. I agree entirely with you that a kind of an economy-wide target-based approach is kind of better for the planet. But I think the reason why we're saying that some countries may only be able to take an action-based approach is because this may well be the first time they've really undertaken this kind of political exercise on target setting. And it would just be premature for a least developed country that has a fraction of the world's emissions to have to be forced to put a quantified outcome-based target in place.
Emilia Holdaway again. So just while we're talking about the links between INDCs, national communications and other documents, I think it's just worth repeating something that Chris mentioned earlier. And I think these documents are very similar with much of their content. There's also important differences in the status of the documents, and for example, where you really do need to have a clear statement of contribution in INDC, that isn't necessarily required in national communication. But I think for countries which have a recent national communication or other international or domestic level documents, I think that means that you don't need to put as much, you can have shorter text in your INDC. So for example, you can have a couple of paragraphs explaining and summarizing your national context, and then you can refer the reader to other documents. The adaptation section was mentioned earlier. You might want to summarize your outlook and approach on adaptation and then refer to these other documents. So we're not needing to duplicate between these documents.
And this is Kieran here. I think, and just to add to Chris and Emilia, that the premise of an INDC was very clearly laid out in the UNFCCC communications. It is an intended contribution to a 2015 global climate agreement, how we will manage emissions post 2020. And I think I went to an event this week run by the Legal Response Initiative, where we were discussing sort of the legalities of discussions and a potential outcome of COP this year in Paris. And I think the general feeling is that the INDCs represent a bottom-up process. So much like national communications and BURs, but they do represent that bottom-up process that would form the foundation for some form of a legal agreement coming out of Paris this year. So I think the premise is very different, although the content is very similar.
Okay, great. We have another question by Johannes. He's a climate policy consultant. He asks whether are mitigation targets checked against what is required by science. From what he understood, parties could not agree on a review mechanism during COP20.
Well, Johannes is right. There was lots of text tabled at Lima, but all we ended up with was a sort of synthesis report. But, you know, it's not, a review doesn't have to be undertaken by the UNFCCC necessarily for people to have a view on whether or not we're getting there in the INDCs. There are quite a lot of think tanks and others out there undertaking analysis, and I'm sure, Johannes, you're aware of some of those. And they will be read by the negotiators from the countries that are seeking an ambitious global agreement. So free riding is not going to be an option. There will certainly be quite a lot of name and shame going on, and discussions about the levels of ambition. I don't think it needs to be done by the UNFCCC.
No. As I understand it, there have been 7 formal submissions, INDC submissions, covering 34 countries, because one of those submissions is from the EU, and one NGO that is currently sort of tracking the contributions that countries are putting on the table has estimated that at the moment those contributions cover 1/3 of global emissions, and by Paris COP we may get somewhere to about 60%, but that's to be seen.
Okay. Rosa Manso has another question. How could INDC's fairness be guaranteed? Looking to the submissions already submitted, they are not well justified in light to equity.
Correct. We had a discussion, a working session on this in Berlin, myself and Chris. I don't know how Chris's group discussion went, but the fairness aspects, I think are fair to say, are one of the least defined. There are no standard metrics for defining fairness and or ambition. And the guide, and I may hand over to Chris and Emilia at this point, gives some suggestions for how a country could demonstrate, or how it feels it can demonstrate that it is making a fair contribution to a global agreement.
Okay, thank you. Dennis has a question about whether the co-benefits of REDD Plus can be included in the INDC? If yes, where in the guide provided here?
Okay, so I would say that could certainly in the mitigation information section, the co-benefits should be identified. If they can be quantified, so much the better, but certainly qualitatively they should be set out there. And I imagine there will be cross-reference in the adaptation section as well. So, but it's a good, I think that's a good, it's a good piece of feedback. If that's not coming through more clearly enough at the moment, it's something that we will address in a second edition.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. One, whether is the consideration of gender is important in the INDC? And the second question, in the last section, means of implementation, it is necessary to put the estimated cost for each activity mitigation and adaptation, as well as the type for their implementation.
Okay.
So about gender.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point to pick up. Mexico's INDC talks specifically about gender. The call to action from Lima, the UNFCCC text, doesn't provide any direction around gender. So I think that's really up to individual countries to pick up. But I agree that's a really important point. And so far, I believe it's only Mexico where we have an example there. The second half of the question.
It talks about whether in the section means of implementation, it is necessary to put the estimated cost for each activity, mitigation and adaptation, as well as the type for their implementation.
Again, I think this is a country choice. I think the more specific that countries are able to be, then the clearer the information is for donors or for investors to pick up. I would say at a minimum, I think it would be useful to flag quite specifically if capacity building or direct funding or direct technical assistance or technology transfer is required. I think if you're able to quantify that is each country's choice. For countries that are looking at quantification, I think something that will really help their case is to indicate what domestic funding might be paired with the international funding that's being sought.
And just to add to that, this is Kieran here. I think something that was again coming through loud and clear from the various regional global platforms for where countries have convened to discuss their INDC preparations is that the quantification element is potentially quite important when you are trying to seek national level, ministerial level sign-in and buy approval for your contribution.
Okay, well, thank you. We have some questions still here. We're going to answer the last one, and then we have others that we can contact you privately and answer to you directly. So we have Wasif here, that he says that Pakistan MOCC wants to engage, but the country has other pressing challenges, so its contribution may be limited. Other LDCs may have the same problems. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you. CDKN, this is Kieran. CDKN is actually supporting Pakistan with its INDC preparation, and that is a story, that is a sentiment that we are hearing from all the countries that we're working with. And I feel, as Chris sort of alluded to earlier, INDCs are an opportunity for these countries to bring their development priorities to the international fore, as well as to sort of mainstream climate change across their national development priorities. So I think there is an opportunity here to both elevate climate change and development and climate compatible development priorities to a higher level.
Okay, well, thank you, Kieran. And thank you all for attending this webinar. We have some additional resources that we want to share with you. So you can find more about the guide and other information on INDCs in our special place in our cdkn.org website. Also, please sign into our monthly newsletter with the latest news on our work. So the webinar also, you can have an archive of this and other future sessions in our CDKN YouTube channel. And please visit our resources and publications in cdkn.org. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So thank you very much for your time, and we hope that you find this webinar useful. Please answer the survey that will come after the webinar so you can tell us what you thought, and also help us plan future webinars depending on your interests. Thank you very much.